The argument is this: we've received all that is, our being, all that is as gift. God has made everything, including space and time. And the God who made everything out of nothing, can that God not raise the dead? And indeed, Christians, I think, must ask themselves, if they find it hard to believe that God can raise the dead to new life, do we find it hard to believe that God created the world? I suspect there's quite a lot of inconsistency here, that people are willing to believe, oh yeah, God created everything, but raising the dead. But it should be the other way around, shouldn't it? I mean, if God created everything out of nothing, then raising the dead is sort of like a piece of cake. It's not hope that the glass, once full, then half empty, will be full again, but the hope that the glass, once full, half empty, will be a fountain overflowing through the bounteous goodness of God. It's a great honor to be asked by Dr. Guy to participate in this series on hope. And we're recording this in the week after Easter. And what an Easter it's been. I'm sure you've all been graphically struck, as I and my students, with the cross, with the empty tomb, with the resurrection. And we're in the week of resurrection. And so you've had a number of very good messages I've seen already on hope, but I'd like to talk a little bit about the resurrection of the dead, because it can't be denied. Death is terrifying and frightening. We've got Paul saying, "O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory?" But the fact of the matter is, it is frightening and terrifying. Even death after fullness of years, death in unexpected times, and yes, let's hope that we don't see so much death, but already we're seeing a lot of that. And as this is the week not just of the crucifixion, but of the resurrection, we should talk about that. I'm also mindful, I was thinking as I was preparing this, that it's just almost exactly a year since the terrific fire that burnt down Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. And I'm sure you saw the footage of it. It was so dramatic, this medieval church going up in flames, and as dramatic and as touching were the citizens of Paris, the young and the old, not notably a religious place in my experience, weeping and crying and kneeling and praying and singing hymns. And people wondered, why was this so? And some people said, well, maybe we're worried about our own mortality. Maybe we are. But it was an amazing thing. And the destruction seemed so total. And yet there was amazing footage the next day. The very early news team went in with the firefighters into the nave of this ravished building. And the nave was full of floods of water from the hoses and charred roof beams. At the back was glowing the cross, and it's the only important thing, the cross and the resurrection. And there was some wonderful reflection at the time, some not so good. I remember that one of our archbishops, Archbishop John Sentamu, an Anglican archbishop, was interviewed by a rather aggressive and famously atheistic radio interviewer. And Sentamu said, that during this fire, he was praying. And the interviewer snapped back, "What were you praying for? What were you praying for?" Interviews always said that kind of thing, but as though those who pray always have a kind of tick list. Here's what we're going to want God to deliver, and I'd like it in this order. When prayer at these times is just a lifting up, like hope, a trust in God who's greater than all our imagining. And I was thinking here of of Christian hope. The wonderful French philosopher wrote during the Second World War, the darkest years of the Second World War, called Gabriel Marcel. Christian hope was not to have all the answers or even to think you had them. That was the province of optimism and utopianism. But hope, Christian hope, is always to be open to that which can only scarcely be glimpsed. In this way, it's like faith. It's the groundwork, faith, love, faith, and hope of our Christian life. And it's interesting that Marcel thought that hope, this kind of absolute hope, like absolute faith, he means here faith in God, is always a response. It's a response, he thought, to understanding that God is our creator. He said, Gabriel Marcel said that hope appears as the response of the creature to that being to whom it's conscious of owing everything it has and upon whom it can impose no conditions whatsoever. And he said, from the moment I find myself before the absolute thou who brought me into being out of nothingness, then despair, which is opposite of hope in Marcel's schemes, is impossible, because the meaning of despair is that God has withdrawn himself from me, and that for the believer is impossible. It's not that we can't feel despair, of course we can, but God, that we can believe that God would withdraw from us, that is impossible. And Marcel also said that religious hope, hope in the thou, is always a connection between a return and something completely new. Always involves an element both of preservation and of restoration. So that what was and yet is now better than before. I think this is quite different from secular views of hope. Often secular view of hope is, I remember someone telling me, oh, hope, that's such a sad word. And I was kind of surprised. And she said, oh, yes, because if you have to hope, it means something's going wrong. You've lost your job, or you've got an illness that's not fully diagnosed. And I thought this is quite different from what I know a lot of Christian people know by hope, which is hope that in a superabundance, because it's hope in God. It's not hope for a specific thing. It's hope in God. So that words about hope, I want to say now something about death and the resurrection of the death, because Christians really believe that death is death. We believe the body dies and the whole person. It's not a dualistic faith where the body dies and some disembodied soul remains. Rather, what we believe as Christians is the resurrection of the body. Well, isn't this part of the problem? I think not a few people will share the views, even amongst Christians, of Roger Scruton, a philosopher who, quite Christian, always one of these philosophers sort of teetering on the edge of Christianity. And he wrote around Easter Sunday last year, how can we believe in such an event? He's speaking of the resurrection, which so completely defies the laws of nature, and for which we have only sketchy evidence summarized in the Gospels, the Acts, and the letters of St. Paul. And I think, at least in this country, that many even within the church, take scant consolation really from the readings we hear at Easter, and have the same question as Roger Scruton: how can we believe in the resurrection of the dead? So let me try to sketch one for you. So Christian belief in the resurrection of the body is not just wishful thinking in response to the one law of nature defying event. It's embedded in Christianity's Jewish past and in our doctrine of God, and specifically in our doctrine of creation, as it comes in right at the beginning of the creeds. I believe in God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, God who makes everything. Now, we know that the ancient Israelites didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead or the life everlasting, or except as a kind of shadowy half-existence in Sheol. And we know that at the time of Jesus, it was debated amongst Jews as to whether the dead would be raised, because the Pharisees and the Sadducees differ on this. The Pharisees, amongst whom was Paul, at then time Saul, before he was a Christian, they hoped for the resurrection of the dead, and the Sadducees disagreed with that. So we know this isn't just though, people strike it up, believe in the resurrection of the dead, pie in the sky, religious people have always believed that. No, they haven't everywhere and always. Jews didn't believe that, Israelites. So where does this come into Israelite religion or Judaism? And I think it's connected with this doctrine of creation that I already sketched with Gabriel Marcel, belief in the one God who brought me forth out of nothing. Because we can see belief in the resurrection of the dead as early as the 3rd century before Christ in the apocryphal book known as Second Maccabees. This is a very interesting text, and it was written in the context of terrific martyrdom of the Jewish people. And it records a story of a Jewish mother who has already lost 6 sons who refused to eat pork, and they're slaughtered as a result. And the youngest is going forth to his death, and she consoles him to go forward because she's confident that after his death he will be raised and return to her. And she says this, and look, it's to do with her doctrine of God. This is in Maccabees 7, if you want to look it up. My child, observe heaven and earth and acknowledge that God made them out of what did not exist, and that mankind came into being in the same way. Make death welcome, so that in the day of mercy I may receive you back in your brother's company. Now, I'm not encouraging everyone to make death welcome, but look at this connection between the power to create all, from what does not exist and the power to raise the dead, which was made by Jews and Christians and subsequently Muslims. And Paul in Romans 4 speaks of Abraham as in the presence of the God in whom he believed, who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. Again, this direct pushing together of resurrection with creation in the first place. So the argument, roughly sketched, is this. I hope you probably didn't expect to get an argument when you're tuning into a little thing about hope, but here you go. The argument is this. We've received all that is, our being, all that is as gift. God has made everything, including space and time. And the God who made everything out of nothing, can that God not raise the dead? Now this belief is grounded in the belief of who our God is, a God of loving faithfulness. And if God loves us in this life, God's love is everlasting. If God is powerful to create, then God is powerful to redeem. We only have to read the Psalms, and not very far in the Psalms, to run across this is a constant theme in the Psalms. Our help is in the name of the Lord who made heaven and earth. This connection between creation and redemption. Now, I don't say this is a proof that the dead will be raised, but it's not incoherent. It's not incoherent as an argument. It's not incoherent theologically or philosophically. And indeed, Christians, I think, must ask themselves, if they find it hard to believe that God can raise the dead to new life, do we find it hard to believe that God created the world? I suspect there's quite a lot of inconsistency here, that people are willing to believe, oh yeah, God created everything, but raising the dead. But it should be the other way around, shouldn't it? I mean, if God created everything out of nothing, then raising the dead is sort of like a piece of cake. Not exactly, but I think you get my meaning. In any case, we know that the resurrection of Jesus was really important for the earliest followers of Jesus, including Paul. And this can't be because it proved the resurrection of the dead, because Paul, as a Pharisee, presumably already believed the dead would be raised. But what it did confirm is that Jesus was the Messiah. This was a sign in the preaching of Paul. And amongst those Jews who believed in the resurrection, this was a sign of the coming of the Messiah. The lame would walk, and the sight would come to the blind, and the dead would be raised. So these are not breaking of the laws of nature, as though God can only twiddle the knobs of nature. God holds all that is in being in the first place. This is the incursion of a new creation, a promise of rebirth, and an affirmation of God's loving faithfulness. So we need to remember, too, that just as Paul taught the resurrection of the dead, Jesus did so, too. Remember, he had a reply to the Sadducees who were doubtful of the resurrection, and this is the way he speaks to them. Have you not read how God said to Moses, I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob? He is the God of not of the dead, but of the living. So that's Jesus. He's the God not of the dead, but of the living. There are two assertions here. First, that since God is the God of the living, then Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, these fathers, must yet somehow be alive. And it's really interesting that often in medieval murals, you'll see, in resurrection murals, you'll see these figures, sometimes wrapped in the bosom of Abraham. They are alive, and we believe in Christ. And that's part of the great motif of the descent into hell that the Orthodox Church is so good about. But I digress here. So there's two assertions here. First, that God is the God of the living, and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob must somehow be alive. And the second, that God is the God of the living. Whatever one's views on the resurrection of the dead, we've arrived at a central teaching of Judaism and Christianity, which might be summarized as choose life. It is about life. And so, as Marcel said, as before, but differently and better than before. It's not hope that the glass, once full, then half empty, will be full again, but the hope that the glass, once full, half empty, will be a fountain overflowing through the bounteous goodness of God. It's never a return then to a simple status quo. And again, to use a phrase that Marcel used that I loved, an undreamed of promotion, a transfiguration. And that's what Easter hope is to stand. It's stand not in terms of our small human hopes, but stand in terms of our faith and hope and love before the God whose goodness we know exceeds all our feeble imaginings. Thank you.